So this is part 2 of our video that critiques some of the views of Jordan Peterson. So previously, we looked at what Jordan had to say about the link between race, IQ, and genetics. And we'll get back to that material at the end of this episode, but in this episode I want us to turn to consider what Jordan says about gender, because he focuses on that topic in the talk that we're looking at. Here Jordan is getting to his argument that gender differences in education and employment are caused by biological, not social, cultural factors, that women are underrepresented in positions of power because they're less competent at undertaking those positions, and that competence is determined by their biology, their genetics. Remember, we came across those views previously when we looked at the founding fathers of psychology, and I told you that those ideas were still around today. Well, here they are in their modern form.
So here's another example of the same thing. Most engineers are male. Why? Because men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And you might say, well, that's sociocultural. It's like, no, it's not.
So Jordan starts by setting up a simplistic binary as a fact, and he implicitly asks us to accept that as fact so that he can then ask the question why that binary exists. So watch out for that. Academics and politicians do that a lot. They slip in an assumption and force you to accept it as true without you realizing it. And so he's claimed that binary is a self-evident truth. It's actually not. It's really easy to dismantle. And he actually contradicts himself later in relation to this binary, and other psychologists also make these arguments, saying that men are biologically determined to be more competitive than women, and that explains why they're more successful in business, and so on. But competition is all about people. You're competing against other people. Highly competitive people are obsessed with their standing in relation to other people. They're not competitive in regards to things. So it would be as true to say that men are obsessed by people as women are. You know, I've seen very few men trying to outcompete a tub of margarine, for example. They try to outcompete their competitors, other people, usually other men. So watch out for those, oh, that was a simplistic binary. Watch out for those simplistic binaries, particularly in regard to gender. They seem intuitively true, but they fall apart after just a little bit of serious thought. The other thing that is interesting is how he separates objects and people, which is that object-subject separation. It's expressed in that difference between individualism and collectivism. It's that thing that sits behind the nature-nurture debate. You know, our behaviour can only be understood in isolation from our environment. Ironically, that's called nature. Or it can be only understood in the context of our environment. That side of the argument is called nurture. See how the whole argument he's setting up sits in that individualistic perspective that asks us to believe that things can be separated out into biology over there and culture over there, as though they're separate categories. Now, I'm hoping that at this stage you're kind of getting why that object-subject symbol sits in our unit logo. You know, the reason why that's there. Now, incidentally, this nature-nurture dichotomy has largely been rejected by modern genetics, because modern genetics states that human experience and behaviour is an extraordinarily complex interaction between nature and nurture. Our genes are enmeshed with our environment, and you can't, in front of a microphone, and you can't understand either in isolation. It makes no sense to try and disentangle them, because you can't. But let's get back to the video and have a look at his argument that gender differences are in fact based on biological, not cultural differences.
And we know that because if you stack up countries by their egalitarian social policies, which you can do quite effectively, and then you look at the overrepresentation of men in STEM fields, The overrepresentation increases as the countries become more egalitarian. So it's not socio-cultural.
What he describes here is known as the gender equality paradox, the finding that in more egalitarian societies, typically Nordic countries like Denmark, Finland and Sweden, you find fewer women working in STEM fields. That's science, technology, engineering and mathematics. And that's surprising because those countries have policies and programs that encourage more women into those careers. Because in those countries, there's more gender equality. So those careers are typically dominated by men. And in egalitarian societies, they seek to reduce gender inequality. So they promote programs that help women into these careers. Now, we've known about this gender paradox thing for many years. But it's a misrepresentation to use this as an argument, as a kind of nullification of social cultural influence over gendered occupational choices, or as some sort of evidence for biological predetermination, that biologically women are no good at maths or science, or they're not interested in such things. The actual researchers who've done this work on the gender paradox generally say that the paradox is evidence of a complex interplay of culture. They don't cite it as evidence of no cultural interplay. And here's why. Countries that have egalitarian social policies also tend to have greater income inequality and also greater income stability. They have lower levels of unemployment and a more stable labour market. And this makes occupational choice less risky. You don't need to worry so much about which subjects you study at school because you won't get locked into a career that either you'll find unsatisfying or poorly paid. All jobs pay about the same, and it's relatively easy to move from one job to another. In less egalitarian societies, STEM jobs, science, technology, engineering, maths, tend to be more stable and better jobs than other jobs, better paid jobs than other jobs, particularly jobs usually undertaken by women, such as care work and nursing. And this is the thing that's likely causing that gender paradox. A woman in a non-egalitarian society might choose to study STEM subjects and go into a STEM career as a way of protecting herself against poor pay and poor job security, poor working conditions, and so on. She might have to fight to get into those jobs, but those STEM jobs, but there's a pretty big incentive there for her, and breaking a gender norm is probably not going to put a woman off, particularly these days. If you live in an egalitarian society, then you're not going to suffer disadvantage by choosing a more gendered career, such as care work or nursing, because it's stable, well paid, and has good conditions. But why would women go for those jobs? You know, if there wasn't something going on there with their biology. Well, women in those egalitarian countries are actually encouraged to... Let's go back a bit. I'm going to go back. Maybe I'm going to have to go all the way back. So we're 8 minutes in. We're nearly there. All about jobs paying the same, and it's relatively easy to move from one job to another. In less egalitarian societies, STEM jobs, science, technology, engineering, maths, tend to be more stable and better paid than other jobs, particularly jobs usually undertaken by women, such as care work and nursing. And this is the thing that's likely causing that gender paradox. A woman in a non-egalitarian society might choose to study STEM subjects and go into a STEM career as a way of protecting herself against poor pay and poor job security. She might have to fight to get into those STEM jobs, but there's a pretty big incentive there for her to do that, and breaking a gender norm is probably not going to put a woman off, particularly these days. If you live in an egalitarian society, then you're not going to suffer disadvantage by choosing a more gendered career, such as care work or nursing, because it's stable and well paid and as good as any other job. But why would women go for those gendered jobs, nursing, care work, and so on? This is the conundrum that they set up, because women in those egalitarian countries are actively encouraged to take up STEM jobs, but they don't. And that's seen as being at the heart of the paradox. Well, here's the second important thing to know about more egalitarian societies. They tend to be more open. They're more open societies. People have greater access to social cultural products that come from outside of their country. TV, film, music, literature, and so on. The products which are the main vehicles for shaping social norms. The argument Jordan makes rests on a hidden premise that these egalitarian countries are somehow hermetically sealed to outside influences. But citizens of these countries actually have greater freedoms and economic resources to access and consume those foreign products, and they've got more income to purchase foreign media content. They have more leisure time to consume that content, and more dispersed and more technologically advanced and less state-controlled communication infrastructures to distribute that content. And they've got more freedom of movement to visit other countries. The statistics on media consumption in Nordic countries substantiates these points. What you find is that particularly young people are consuming lots of foreign content, and they're spending much more time on YouTube and on Netflix than they are watching over-the-air national TV broadcast. So it's rather naive to think that there's no social cultural influence coming from outside, that they're only influenced by the culture of the country in which they live. You know, that they can be so readily isolated to state-based jurisdictions. The gender paradox would only be a gender paradox in a totalitarian state, where there are no outside influences and population's behaviour is only shaped by the cultural norms promoted by the state. A state where the media is strictly controlled and where immigration is prohibited, or in a nation state which is technologically isolated. You know, say like North Korea. But those countries are not part of the gender paradox. Now let's move on to the final clip, where Jordan returns to talk about race and IQ.
Okay, so back to IQ. One final thing to say about IQ. The ethnic differences are difficult to dispense with. It's not easy to make them go away. You can say, well, the tests aren't culture fair. Well, here's a test of that. So imagine you test group A with an IQ test and you test group B with an IQ test, and then you look at their actual performance in whatever you're predicting. If the test was biased against ethnic group A, then it would underpredict their performance, and that doesn't happen. Now you could say, well, there's systemic bias in the performance measures and the potential measures, and that's a possibility. All right.
Did you spot a pattern here? He did this at the start of the video. He acknowledges a counter-argument and then asks you to brush it away, even though actually it's a very strong counter-argument. He gives an impression that it's not a counter-argument that would do any serious damage to his position. The counter-argument is that IQ testing is culturally biased. He acknowledges it and then shows us that it's not by citing the link between the tests and the outcomes. But then he acknowledges that there might also be a bias in those outcomes, how those outcomes are measured and defined. That maybe there's a bias against black people in employment, that there's a cultural bias against black people. That's actually a really strong counter-argument, and there's actually significant empirical support to substantiate it, that actually black people are being discriminated against in employment. And the cause of that is what we call racism. But Jordan pushes that counter-argument aside and moves on with his argument that IQ and race are genetically linked. So let's finish up. What I've been trying to show by bringing Jordan Peterson into the unit and showing that video of him talking about his views on IQ, race, gender. I'm hoping to show you how critical thinking works here, both in terms of thinking about interests or interest groups that are served by particular arguments, also about how binaries sit in and among many of those arguments, but also the importance of making strong arguments and not dismissing counter-arguments simply because they are unsettling or disruptive. Unsettling or disruptive to certain groups. And this unit is based on those counter-arguments that are unsettling and disruptive, and asks you to seriously consider them because there's value in those counter-arguments. And often those counter-arguments are dismissed, perhaps because they unsettle particularly powerful groups in society. So there's another thing, a more pointed thing. We really need to disrupt these arguments about how social inequalities, such as those experienced by women and black people, are somehow natural, that they reflect biological differences. That argument posits that those inequalities are immutable, that you can't change them because they're the result of hardwired differences between those social groups. It's a position that's used to argue against progressive social change. It's a position that the social movements have to push back on all of the time. And it's also an argument based on a flawed understanding of genetics and a flawed understanding of biology. Okay, let's finish up. So that was the second of our two psychologists, Jordan Peterson. So thank you, Jordan, for joining the unit. And I shall see you next time. Ta-da.